Anzaldua was born in 1942 in the Valley of Texas and died in 2004 from complications with diabetes. She was a renowned scholar of Chicana theory and queer theory, as well as a multifaceted artist scholar, lesbian feminist, and Chicana poet shamana, in her own words. She received her BA in English, Art, and Secondary Education from Pan American University, and her MA in English and Education from the University of Texas at Austin. Her PhD was awarded posthumously from UC Santa Barbara, and her doctoral dissertation was published just a couple years ago. Her first book, Borderlands La Frontera, was published in the 80s. She begins this book by giving a concise history of the US-American border in the Southwest, the place where she grew up. It is an open wound where the third world grates against the first and bleeds. The borderland is the lifeblood of two different worlds merging to form a third country, a border culture. Borders are set up to define places that are safe versus unsafe, to distinguish us versus them. A border is a dividing line, a narrow strip along a steep edge. A borderland is a vague and undetermined place created by the emotional residue of an unnatural boundary, and it is in a constant state of transition. In order to understand the US-Mexican border in the American Southwest, Anzaldua goes on to give a brief history of the conquest. By the 16th century CE, Cortes and the Spanish invade and decimate the indigenous population from over 1,500 million to under 1.5 million pure-blooded Indians. This is also the birth of a new race, the Mestizo, people of mixed Indian and Spanish descent, the Chicanos, Mexican Americans, who have immunity to European diseases and inherit the continent. What happened next was that Chicanos explored and settled in parts of the US Southwest, mixing again with native North Americans. All of the Southwest at this time was in Mexico: Texas, California, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, all Mexico. Fast forward to the 1800s, when Anglos, or gringos, white Americans, migrate with their doctrine of white superiority and land sovereignty. This leads to the Spanish-American Wars, the Battle of the Alamo, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. America at this time annexes about half of Mexico, and 100,000 remaining Mexican citizens are annexed by conquest, becoming American citizens overnight. Anzaldua defines the Chicanx people as the Aztecas of the north, or Ashinabeg people, and she argues they are the single largest population of people with Indian descent in the United States. The annexing of half of Mexico initiates a history of race conflict and land theft, economic imperialism leading up to the present day, a new wave of migration now moving from Mexico to the American Southwest due to economic necessity. And a culture or third closed country of the borderlands emerges, where los atravesados, that is those who are prohibited to cross, and the border police clash, and where Chicanos and other non-white people are oppressed and exploited. For Anzaldua, los atravesados, or those who cannot cross, are permanently liminalized people. Anzaldua likens their situation to an old Navajo protection song, quote, "Now among the alien gods with weapons of magic I am." Anzaldua's own brother, although an American citizen, was rounded up one day when she was a child because he had no papers and didn't speak English, and he walked home from Guadalajara. Her chapter, Entering into the Serpent, can be read as a psychological mythic journey. In Chicana folktale, the serpent is both a symbol of proliferating evil and potential rape. "Don't go to the outhouse at night," her mother would tell her, "or a serpent will crawl into your nalgas," as well as an indigenous totem spirit. Anzaldua describes how she overcame her fear of what the serpent had come to represent in her culture and discovered a kinship with the serpent. One day she was in fact bit by a serpent and dreamed that rattler fangs filled her mouth, scales covering her body, and in the morning she saw through the eyes of the snake, felt snake blood coursing through her, and the serpent became mi tono, that is, my totemic or animal counterpart, Anzaldua becoming forever immune to its venom. The wisdom of the serpent gives Anzaldua courage to re-envision the myths of her tribe, even and especially as she finds them in herself as limiting beliefs. Quote, "There is a rebel in me, a shadow beast. It is part of me that refuses to take orders from the outside authorities. It refuses also to take orders from my conscious will. It threatens the sovereignty of my rulership. It is that part of me that hates constraints of any kind. At the least hint of limitations, it kicks out, bolts." Throughout this chapter and the next one, Anzaldua describes the mythical, spiritual, and shamanic roots of her shadow work in terms of Mayan and Aztec religious traditions and symbols, and subsequent configurations of the divine feminine under Christianization. And she finds three basic forms of the divine feminine in Chicana culture: the Lady of Guadalupe, the Virgin or the Nurturing Mother, the Cursed or Screwed Mother, La Chingada, and the Weeping Woman, La Llorona. Above all, Anzaldua dreams of an earlier Aztec goddess, Coatlicue, or snaky skirts, from which she develops what she calls La Facultad. Writing, "I know things older than Freud, older than gender. That's how I think of La Vibora, the snake woman. Like the ancient Olmecs, I know Earth is a coiled serpent. 40 years it's taken me to enter into the serpent, to acknowledge that I have a body, that I am a body, and to assimilate the animal body, the animal soul." It seems that the myths Anzaldua grew up with involved a folk Catholicism with many pagan elements. For example, La Virgin de Guadalupe is Coatlalopu, herself descended from the earlier Aztec goddess Coatlicue, or serpent skirts. Anzaldua notes how Azteca Mexicana culture already had driven female deities into the margins, and this process only increased. Tonanzi, or the positive side of the female, is separated out, eventually becoming the chaste virgin and protectress, who becomes the central feminine figure in all Mexican cultures. Guadalupe eventually becoming synonymous with La Virgin Maria by the Catholic Church and with La Cultura Chicana. This leaves Coatlicue, or La Chingada, as the whore, beast, or raped mother who is abandoned, and La Llorona as the mother who seeks her lost children. Like many Indians and Mexicans, Anzaldua writes, "I did not deem my psychic experiences real. I denied their occurrence and let my inner sense atrophy. I allowed white rationality to tell me that the existence of the other world was mere pagan superstition. Institutionalized religion," she writes, "fears trafficking with the spirit world and stigmatizes it as witchcraft. It fears what Jung calls the shadow, the unsavory aspects of ourselves, but even more, it fears the superhuman, the God in us." For Anzaldua, voodoo, Santeria, shamanism, and other native religions are called cults, and their beliefs are called mythologies. Describing her relationship with La Vibora, or her guardian spirit, she writes that a deep stillness comes over her. "I'm aware of my breath and my heartbeat, but nothing else. Time collapses, the body shifts gear, mi cuerpo becoming part of and merging with, disappearing into surroundings. I feel my body's intense focus on and awareness of the snake. I'm seeing it, and it's seeing me. My body sends tendrils of awareness from my solar plexus to the snake's body, and my consciousness flows out along these threads and into La Vibora. My tongue becomes her tongue, testing and tasting the air. When my consciousness flows into the animal, it becomes my vehicle to see, feel, touch, hear, taste, and smell in the underworld or other world." For Anzaldua, psychoanalysis calls these altered phenomenological realms the unconscious, an abstract concept, the unknown land. For Anzaldua, these totemic animal spirits are real and imaginal at the same time, and the world they initiate her into is one of perspective and language. The mother of serpents, La Vibora, goes back for Anzaldua to Coatlicue, an Aztec goddess of sacrifice that she associates with healing trauma. Let's check out the Khan Academy video on the Coatlicue basalt sculpture.
We're in the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City, and we're looking at a monumental basalt sculpture. This is just fantastic.
So what we're looking at is the famous Coatlicue.
Now, Coatlicue is an Aztec goddess.
She is the mother of the patron deity Huitzilopochtli.
He's one of the principal gods of the Aztec pantheon.
He's the god of war, and he's also associated with the sun.
But here we're seeing a monumental sculpture of this goddess, and in fact, we think that she was one of several monumental figures of goddesses found in the sacred precinct under what is now Mexico City.
The sacred precinct was located at the very center of the Aztec capital city of Tenochtitlan. We refer to the sacred precinct as the axis mundi, this center of the world, the axis point around which the entire universe revolved, for the Aztecs.
This is late in Aztec culture. In just a couple of decades, the Spanish will arrive and the Aztec Empire will be dismantled. But at this point, the Aztecs ruled Mesoamerica.
They ruled a vast portion of Mesoamerica, not the entirety, but a large portion of what is is today, say, central Mexico. And this is one of the most amazing sculptures to stand before, and yet here we are in the Anthropology Museum, and we're standing among so many incredible, finely carved basalt sculptures. What I always find so wonderful about her is that she's leaning forward.
Well, it makes her feel even more monumental, even more dangerous, even more present as we stand before her. So this is a really complicated figure. Let's start at the bottom. We do see 2 feet, but these feet have claws and they have eyes.
These are like monster feet. They're zoomorphized with these talons and eyes.
And as we rise up, we see fur or feathers and patterned areas. And it's important to remember all of this would have originally been brightly painted.
And above that, the most important component of this sculpture, or at least how we identify the sculpture, is the skirt. We have all of these amazing intertwined snakes.
And you can see not only the snakes' heads, but also their rattles. These are rattlesnakes, poisonous snakes. They're intertwined in the most complex ways.
Her name literally means snaky skirt, or snakes her skirt.
And for instance, one of the other large female figures that we see from this precinct is known as hearts for skirt. And instead of snakes, we see human hearts. That skirt is bound together by this belt, which has both on the front and the back a human skull.
And the skull is fastened together with another 2 snakes, and the tassels of the belt are the heads of these snakes.
Perhaps the most terrifying part of the sculpture is just above that, where we see a necklace made up of alternating hands and human hearts.
This necklace covers her exposed torso, and we can actually see her pendulous breasts indicating that she given birth to children, which is also referenced in the roll on her stomach. For me, I think the part that I always have found most interesting is the fact that she's decapitated.
And we know that because we can see these circular forms just above the clavicle.
Those circles are signs of preciousness, which in this case is probably a reference to blood, some kind of precious liquid.
So what we're seeing above that is not her head, but instead 2 snakes that are winding out of her neck and come together face to face.
This is a convention for spurting blood. And what's wonderful about this is these 2 snakes almost form a frontal-facing snake head. We see the tongues hanging down, the bared teeth, and this is really where Aztec sculptors, for me, are so impressive. We not only have the scales of the snakes defined, but also even the underbelly of the snakes.
And then there are the arms. These are a little bit hard to read. We have her forearm up so that the back of her hand is against her shoulder.
It almost has this impression as if she's about to pounce. And then we have snakes rising from her wrists, which also indicates that she was dismembered at the wrists. And that again, we have maybe spurting blood from where her hands would have been.
But this is only the front of the sculpture. And the sculpture is actually carved in the round, not only on the sides, but also on the back and even underneath.
And as we walk to the back, what you can also see on the arms that are pulled back are, like the feet, monster joints, these kind of zoomorphized faces with bared teeth, with the eyes, and of course this wonderful snake skirt.
And a kind of bustle that shows the snakes woven together with their rattles as tassels.
And another skull fastened at the belt.
But what I found most fascinating is that this massive piece of stone is actually carved below as well, with a shallow relief carving which we can see in reproduction.
On the bottom of this sculpture we have the Earth Lord, or Tlaltecutli.
So this god, the earth god, would have had this sculptural relief facing him, that is facing down to the earth.
We actually see this on a lot of Aztec sculptures where this Earth Lord would have been touching the surface of the earth.
Think about the engineering that's involved here, moving a piece of basalt this large, but then being able to upend it so that you can carve the bottom of it and then move it into place without destroying it is a phenomenal idea. When the sculpture was found in 1790 in what was then New Spain, this must have been a terrifying image that was counter to everything that the Europeans and their Christianity represented.
When this was dug up near the main temple of the Aztecs in what had formerly been the sacred precinct, it was discovered with the famous calendar stone, or more correctly, the sunstone. And people were both fascinated and disturbed by this sculpture in particular because it was so different than anything that they had seen. And so they reburied it because it was considered so terrifying, whereas they took the other sculpture and placed it into the exterior of the cathedral.
I love that this was so terrifying that it had to be reburied and that it was only excavated much more recently. So much of this iconography, so much of the imagery that's carved onto this figure is terrifying, is aggressive to our sensibilities today, and I think it's led so many people to emphasize the issue of human sacrifice in Aztec culture.
Human sacrifice did occur, not to the extent that early colonial Spanish sources proclaim. There are sources that claim that 84,000 people were killed in a single day, which logistically just seems a little challenging. And I think where we can see some of those potential references to sacrifice would be in things like the necklace of human hearts and hands.
Which might be a poetic metaphor, but it may also be a metaphor for sacrifice itself. But now in the 21st century, to see a towering sculpture 10 feet tall, this massive stone depicting human hearts and human hands, fangs and snakes, it is a stunning image.
And I think is a true testament to the artists of Mexica culture, Aztec culture. This particular sculpture is very well preserved, and it shows us the interest in the natural world, say in the snakes, but combined where you have this wonderful vision of a supernatural deity.
For Anzaldua, this complex goddess who was so terrifying that she had to be reburied comes to symbolize the shadow beast or dark aspect of the mythical unconscious. What must be both healed and empowered if we are to reckon with the deep spiritual lessons of myth. Coatlicue in Anzaldua's work thus becomes a symbol of addiction, paralysis, alchemical negrito, and the work being done in this time that is painful and slow. Coatlicue is a monstrous goddess giving life to all and devouring all, a rupture in our everyday consciousness. She is the mother archetype as well, duality, synthesis, and a third perspective beyond duality and involving a new unity. Coatlicue is beauty and horror and the prelude to a crossing. What comes after Coatlicue? Simply that which abides in wholeness, which Anzaldua calls Coalquaqui, that is the moon goddess or Coatlicue's daughter, as a creative process of self-engendering. Anzaldua concludes on Coatlicue, it is by learning to live with her that we transform living in the borderlands from a nightmare into a numinous experience. It is always a path state to something else. Blocks, or Coatlicue, or shamanic states, are related for Anzaldua to her cultural identity and the painful process of confusion she suffers as embedded in a larger creative process of cultural shift. In her chapter, The Path of the Red and the Black Ink, Anzaldua explores the mythopoetics of shamanism, or what she calls the Coatlicue state, in terms of the role of art. This chapter has been criticized a little bit as involving some indigenous appropriationism, but its basic points are still valuable and interesting. For Anzaldua, tribal works of art can be works of the moment, such as the mask, or those that exist perpetually in performance, such as the totem pole. The mask is only donned in the context of the liminal phase of ritual, whereas the totem pole stands guard over the community during everyday life as well. Anzaldua sees art's community function as validating human beings to each other and the world, and criticizes Western aestheticism, especially the idea of art for art's sake. She recommends art as a shamanic state of trafficking in images, that is, in myths which serve a renewing and healing community function. Shamanistic performance and indigenous art did not split the artistic from the functional or art from everyday life. Rather, religious, social, and aesthetic purposes of art were all intertwined. Poets gathered to, quote, play music, dance, sing, read poetry in open-air places, and they were, in every sense, a tree in flower for the community. The artist is thus for Anzaldua a shapeshifter, nahual, or shaman. Anzaldua speaks of the artwork in terms of the mythic presences invoked by it. The work has an identity, it is a who or a what, and contains the presences of persons, incarnations of gods or ancestors, as well as natural and cosmic powers. The work manifests the same need as a human being, it needs to be fed. When evoked in rite, the object or event is present, that is, enacted. It is both a physical thing and the power that infuses it, and the artwork for Anzaldua can thus be defined as metaphysical, in that it spins its energies between the gods and humans, but its task is to move the gods. This type of artwork dedicates itself to managing the universe and its energies, and Anzaldua says she's not really sure what the artwork is when it is at rest, not in performance. Sounding a bit like Martin Heidegger in his Origin of the Work of Art essay, Anzaldua writes, "A mask may only have the power of presence during a ritual dance, and the rest of the time it may be a mere thing." Some works exist forever invoked, always in performance, and this is where Anzaldua speaks of totem poles as well as cave paintings. Invoked indigenous art is communal and speaks of everyday life. It is dedicated to the validation of humans, that is, it makes us hopeful, happy, secure, but it can have negative effects as well, which propel our search towards validation. Anzaldua also critiques ethno and Eurocentrism in the understanding of art and aesthetics, writing, "Ethnocentrism is the tyranny of Western aesthetics. An Indian mask in an American museum is transposed into an alien aesthetic system where what is missing is the presence of power invoked in the performance ritual. Modern Western painters have borrowed, copied, or otherwise extrapolated the art of tribal cultures and called it cubism, surrealism, and symbolism. This is very true. So Anzaldua writes, let's stop importing Greek myths and the Western Cartesian split point of view and root ourselves in the mythological soil and soul of this continent. Modernity can be defined as the rise of the subject-object split and its subsequent tyranny in Western aesthetics. The reconstruction of the ancient world promoted by modernity tends to go back to Greco-Roman or Judeo-Christian myth. Anzaldua daringly asks if we might not have the courage for a fundamental reorientation which opens up and takes seriously the myths from around here. In some of the more insulting and controversial passages in this chapter, she critiques white American aesthetics in particular, writing, "Instead of surreptitiously ripping off the vital energy of POCs and putting it to commercial use, whites could allow themselves to share and exchange and learn from us in respectful ways. By taking up curanderismos, santeria, shamanism, Taoism, Zen, and otherwise delving into the spiritual life and ceremonies of multicolored peoples, Anglos would perhaps lose the white sterility they have in their kitchens, bathrooms, hospitals, mortuaries, and missile bases." This is a bit of a startling recommendation to a sort of generalized New Age appropriation of POC cultures, but it is understandable in light of the 60s, 70s, and 80s America in which Anzaldua grew up. I think recommendations like this still have a lot of value today as useful correctives, even if they have had some unfortunate consequences in contemporary New Age communities, very often fusing the cultures of traditional peoples into an unrooted New Age hodgepodge. Anzaldua's later phase of work can be characterized as frustration at the lack of receptivity to, in her earlier works, the deeper themes of feminist spirituality. Borderlands La Frontera was mostly read as about hybridic or intersectional identity. In a short piece, Metaphors in the Tradition of the Shaman, she writes, "In Borderlands, I articulated the debilitating state that women and colonized peoples go through and the resulting disempowerment. It is not easy to get out of these states. If we are lucky, we create, like the shaman, images that induce altered state of consciousness, conducive to self-healing. Posthumously published dissertation can then be read as an aesthetic and ethical artwork outlining an epistemic and ontological self-healing process. Its guiding idea is that of the Coyolcuauhqui imperative. Coyolcuauhqui, who you can see in the upper right here, was the daughter of Coatlicue. For Anzaldua, she symbolizes a struggle to reconstruct oneself and heal the sustos resulting from wounding, trauma, racism, and other acts of violation that shatter the soul. Anzaldua notes that she finds people using metaphors such as Borderlands in a more limited sense than she had intended, so now she intends to expand on psychic and emotional Borderlands by using the term Nepantla. Most readings of Borderlands focus on the border people, or the atravesados, in the liminal phase, and in terms of the geopolitics. Anzaldua wants her readers to become more aware of the spiritual healing of this psychic condition and social situation by pointing to nepantleras, that is, to the positive features of what Turner had called liminal personae. Nepantleras are those more or less perpetually involved in Nepantla, which Anzaldua defines as the psychic space of the in-between or spirit world, never fully belonging to any location. Nepantleras, those between worlds and in multiple worlds, shuttle in liminal perspectives and decolonize reality by producing luminoid genres. Thus, in Anzaldua's later work, she understands art, the artist, and the process of creativity in terms of two fundamental indigenous terms. One, Coatlicue, the daughter of Coatlicue, as an aesthetic drive or imperative towards wholeness and healing, and two, Nepantla, as the in-between or liminal space, whereby divergent worlds are in contact from a realm beyond the sensuous versus the supersensuous. That is the realm of imagination itself, as it encounters the split between each world's ordinary sense of reality and the extraordinary manifestation of the work. On Nepantla as in between, she writes, I'm constantly struggling with my own ways of cultural production and the role that I play as an artist. I call the space where I struggle with my creations Nepantla. Nepantla is the place where my cultural and personal codes clash, where I come up against the world's dictates, and where these different worlds coalesce in my writing. I am conscious of various Nepantla: linguistic, geographical, gender, sexual, historical, cultural, political, social, when I write. Nepantla concerns automatically infuse my writing. I don't have to will myself to deal with this. Nepantla inhabits me and surfaces whenever I create. Nepantlas are places of constant tension, where the missing or absent pieces can be summoned back, and where transformation and healing may be possible, my wholeness just out of reach, yet attainable. Here you see Ines Rodriguez's famous painting, Nepantla, to symbolize this psychic state. Note the two worlds, on the left and the right, the magic carpet, the military yet relaxed posture, the mysterious identity of the Nepantlera, clock or time and history of the world, as well as the rooster, symbolizing both death and healing and rebirth. Nepantla, like Coatlicue, is an Aztec mythical figure, usually associated with the transition to death and the other world. So lastly this week, we're going to give a closer reading of Anzaldua's comments on art, creativity, artists, and aesthetics in her posthumously published dissertation, Light in the Dark, or Rewriting Identity, Spirituality, Reality, where these notions of Nepantla that we've already covered a bit are more carefully explored. In the first chapter, which I've assigned you guys, called Gestures of the Body, Anzaldua describes her creative process of writing as a discovery and perception that produces knowledge, or what she calls conocimiento, maybe better translated as insight or wisdom. The shadows of the individual and collective unconscious are bound up with what she calls desconocimientos, namely the ignorance that we cultivate to keep ourselves from what we know so that we don't have to be accountable. These individual and collective shadows have a tenacious hold on us. But each irritant is a grain of sand in the oyster of the imagination. Sometimes what accretes around an irritant or a wound may produce a pearl of great insight, a novel theory. Anzaldua's project here is to develop an epistemology of the imagination within a psychology of the image. She wants to use a creative form of imagistic thinking in order to guide her on a Nepantla. Nepantlera, Anzaldua's model here for both spiritual activism and for art, are those people who see from the cracks, rifts or fissures of ordinary and extraordinary reality within different worlds of a collective. They provide us with a Nepantla perspective, a view from the cracks, rather than a single culture or ideology. Dwelling in liminalities, or in-between states, Nepantleras, of which artists are a particularly vivid form, refuse to turn right onto the dominant culture's assimilation or acquiescence highway. The Nepantla mindset eliminates polarity thinking. It focuses not on the either-or, but on the both-and. Anzaldua understands the relationship between Nepantleras and Nepantla as that of a psyche between artists. Writing, direct interpretive engagements between artists and their images have few precedents. There's very little direct personal artistic research, so I've had to engage with my own experiences and construct my own formulations. I use various storytelling formats consistent with the experiences that I reflect on, and I use whatever language and style that correspond to the way I do the work. I believe that meditation on and conscious awareness of the image's significance for me and for you, its reader, interpreter, co-creator, furthers rather than obstructs the making of art. Defining the task of the artist much more clearly and helpfully than Rilke, and a bit more like Derrida in his hauntology, she writes, "My job as an artist is to bear witness to what haunts us, to step back and to attempt to see the pattern in these events, and how we can repair the damage by using imagination and its vision." I believe in the transformative power of medicine and art. And like many of the thinkers we have studied and will study, the purpose of art is at least in part political. Our country's real battle is with its shadow, its racism, its propensity for violence, its rapacity for consuming, its neglect of responsibility to global communities and the disenfranchised, especially people of color. As an artist, I feel compelled to expose the shadow side that the mainstream media and government denies. To understand our complicity and responsibility, we must look at the shadows. Nepantleras are these artistas, activistas, which help us to mediate transitions, help us to make crossings, and guide us through transformational processes, so that we can end up in the position of what Anzaldua calls conocimiento, or wisdom. Art for Anzaldua is always from Nepantla. It is using imagination to discover how we feel and think, and to help us and others respond to the world. It is in Nepantla that we write and make art, bearing witness to the attempt to achieve resolution and balance where there may be none in everyday life. In Nepantla, we try to gain a foothold in the remolinos, the vortices or quagmires, and we try to put a psycho-spiritual political frame on life's journey. In short, according to her literary executor, Anna Louise Keaton, Anzaldua calls for a new aesthetics, an entirely embodied artistic practice that synthesizes identity formation with cultural change and movement among multiple realities. The path of art leads us from remolinos to conocimiento, from chaotic disruptions, violence, and death, to a state of dissociation and fragmentation from which the aesthetic drive to wholeness emerges. In trying to make sense of what's happening, some of us come into deep awareness of our political and spiritual situation and the unconscious mechanisms that abet hate, intolerance, and discord. By searching, inquiring, and healing through these coatlicue states of consciousness, imaginative creativity guides us into a new condition of conocimiento. The essence of art could thus be characterized for Anzaldua as a kind of spiritual activism. Spirit in the world becomes conscious, and we become conscious of spirit in the world. The healing of our wounds results in transformation, and transformation results in the healing of our wounds. So art is a function for Anzaldua of the social imaginary. It changes the thoughts and ideas or stories we live by and their limiting beliefs, and helps us to extend our hands to others. Although fate and history are outside of the individual control, how we react to them and what we do about them are within our control. So let's use art and imagination to discover how we feel and think and help us respond to the world. Not only is Nepantla liminal, but it is the connective tissue between the three layers of the cosmic tree and between the conscious and the unconscious dimensions of the human psychic experience. Anzaldua writes regarding Nepantla, perceiving something from two different angles creates a split in awareness that can lead to the ability to control perception, to balance contemporary society's worldview with non-ordinary worldviews, and to move between them to a space that simultaneously exists and does not exist. I call entering this realm Nepantla, a Nahuatl word for an in-between space, el lugar entre medio, the place in between. Nepantla for Anzaldua is importantly a palabra indígena, an indigenous word, and a concept that refers to a place that is no place. The later Anzaldua dares to claim that what Western philosophy has tended to regard as merely mythical entities, gods, daimons, shamanic journeyings attested in indigenous worldviews and Western esoterica, are perfectly real. She embraces the ontological belief in the existence of things outside the body, exosomatic, as opposed to the belief that material reality is a projection of merely mentally created images. This commits her to the task of articulating a metaphysics of interconnectedness to explain what the spirit world revealed from Nepantla is, as well as an epistemically informed psychology of the imagination to account for how we know it. So in a way, Nepantla is the key to Anzaldua's theory and provides a kind of method. To explore Nepantla, she writes, must redefine the imagination, not as a marginal non-reality, nor as an altered state, but rather as another type of reality. What Nepantla is as the in-between space, or an indigenous word that refers to a place that is no place, can be defined philosophically for Anzaldua in 3 points. Nepantla is the transcendental imagination, as well as the abyssal body, in which we have our psychic home. Nepantla is the interface between materiality and immateriality. Where the material and the immaterial invisible idea collide, we have the mundus imaginalis, and Nepantla is both ordinary mortal experience as well as an extraordinary divine event, all come together in Anzaldua's Nepantla concept as a point of contact and a bridge between different worlds. Anna Louise Keating sums up the core concepts of Anzaldua's philosophy as follows. She says that Anzaldua presents poet shamanic aesthetics involving certain key concepts, such as El Mundo Zerdo, the left-handed world, El Cenote, the source, Nepantla, Nepantleras, liminality and liminal beings, Conocimiento, knowing, La Facultad, Coalquaqui, imperative, that is shamanic dismemberment, aesthetic drive to wholeness, and the Coatlique state, understood as the cathexis and catharsis of trauma. Anzaldua's use of the creative imagination in her concept of Nepantla goes back to Henry Corbald's book Mundus Imaginalis. There, in Anzaldua, the distinction is drawn between the literal and the psychic, the perceptual and the imaginal, between literal and psychic truth, just as between perceptual and imaginal reality. There is a zone of indistinction or sphere of undecidability. Corbald calls this the Mundus Imaginalis. Conocimiento is knowing as well as wisdom. And it emerges for Anzaldua from Nepantla as that mediating in-between in which material forces and immaterial images collide, creating remolinos or vortices. From within these vortices, the psyche wrests transformative insight, conocimiento. Knowing is, according to her account, neither simply perceptual nor merely imaginal, neither a simple matter of fact nor abstract speculation, but knowing includes scientific and humanist knowing about phenomena, just as it includes the act of imagining or dreaming while awake in sueños along with the phenomena. Conocimiento is thus for Anzaldua similar to the dream or fantasy process, resembling the magical flight of journeying shamans. Why do we need a dual vision? Why do we need Nepantla as a basis for our existentials education? Because each reality is only a description, a system of perception and language. When you learn to access other realities, you undo one description of plain level of reality and construct others. You learn a new language and a new way of viewing the world, and you bring this magical knowledge and apply it to the everyday world. According to Don Juan, you must stop the world before you can apprehend a separate reality. You learn that your former descriptions and frameworks were inadequate, and henceforth you see the world with a new set of eyes, a dual vision. In sum, Nepantla, although a mythic concept, explains everything for Anzaldua and has a properly philosophical role to play in her ontology. Looking over all the passages in which she defines and describes or writes from Nepantla, Nepantla ends up being almost everything. There is the Nepantla body, the Nepantla brain, the Nepantla perspective, imagination, psyche, mind, and spirit are all described in terms of Nepantla. Nepantla is a state of affairs in the world as well as their incorporeal truth. Nepantla is the material or maternal substrate of our existence, matter or nature, as well as the ritual interval in which we realize it. Nepantla is both this worldly and otherworldly. It's for Anzaldua the place-space of any given spirit or faculty, la facultad. Nepantla is anterior to the lower, middle, and upper world distinctions of the cosmic tree. Nepantla is both a liminal suspension and a liminoid chiasmus or creativity. Nepantla is the interaction of nature, spirit, and humans and gods, and it is a place, no place, existence, non-existence. It is being and nothingness. And if this wasn't enough, Anzaldua goes on, Nepantla is also compositional and decompositional states. Nepantla engirds our unconscious, subconscious, and conscious layers. Nepantla is a connective tissue, bridge, or point of contact, threshold between the worlds. Nepantla can also be a trip or a journey, being on a Nepantla, involving orientation and disorientation, blockage, as well as creativity, Coatlique and Coalquaqui. Nepantla is an indigenous notion and it decolonizes reality. Nepantla is the condition of possibility for human rootedness as well as rhizomes, the way that mycorrhizal soul structures proliferate, as do fungi, and Nepantla is the condition of possibility for soul making as well as for reclaiming a lived onto epistemology or theory of reality within a more rooted indigenous theory of knowledge. Nepantla is basically the unground, the urground, or primordial ground, as well as the everyday ground for knowledge, wisdom, conocimiento as such. More simply, Nepantla can be defined for Anzaldua as an access hub to the spirit world. She writes, "We are bonded to this planet in ways we don't even imagine. We are in a partnership with the earth, but the partnership must go both ways. We must demonstrate trust, love, respect, and reciprocity to make this bond work, a human yearning and an essential human need to witness the flow of life and the patterns manifested in life. The spiritual is a deep sense of belonging and participation in life. So why is any of this Nepantla and spiritual stuff relevant for Anzaldua's philosophy of art and aesthetics? Well, in her own words, the mind's unconscious workings play a huge part in both our reading and our creating of works of art. After receiving or dreaming the initial inspiration, which exists as an inner vision, the work demands to come into being during periods of incubation. It needs to be fed or loved, and this stirs the artist to take action towards the act of making. It is thus that conocimiento initiates the relationship between self-knowledge and creative work. The paradox is that in reading or making art and making the self, we are simultaneously remembering and forgetting the old self and the old world and making new selves and new worlds. Creation, or what we learned earlier in the course is poesis, is really a rereading and a rewriting of reality, as the subtitle to this book indicates, where this creative process takes many forms. For Anzaldua, in the Western or Promethean story, the artist acts independently and often against creativity or the creator. Rather than thinking of creativity and art as a partnership, the artist steals the power of creativity from a god and creates out of her own ego or private genius and her own limitations. And in other narratives, as we've seen from Plato to Kant and beyond, the artist surrenders to the creative process, the creative urge to the god, and allows the story artwork to be channeled through her. Creativity for Anzaldua is a liberational impulse, an activity that transforms materials and the energy or being of reality as a whole. It stems from the impulse to use the capacities of your mind, body, soul collaboratively to create. The creative process demands the reconciliation of conflicting impulses and ideas. It calls forth higher consciousness and awareness and brings you into a deeper connection with self and the materials you work with. All this brings us to the remarks on art and aesthetics that are coming a bit later in Anzaldua's chapters, which is the bulk of the material I've assigned you guys to read this week. Having set up this rich conception of Nepantla and shamanic creativity, Anzaldua now turns her attention to the history of Chicana art and Aztec or Mesoamerican art, with this epigraph, stating, "Border artists inhabit the transitional space of Nepantla. Chicana artists thus create a new culture mix, una mestizada." The ostensible impetus was Anzaldua's presence at the opening of the world of Moctezuma. Anzaldua is disconcerted by the fact that she's passively consuming and appropriating indigenous culture that is in fact her own. She walks in with a group of Chicano kids who are also being taught secondhand their own cultural roots, twice removed by whites. On one level, the exhibit is a perfect exemplar of colonialism, ripping off a culture and regurgitating its white version to the natives. The museum itself for Anzaldua is a colonized structure. It enacts a psychosis of sorts, implying that all Aztecs are dead and only inhabit prehistory. It induces a double beingness in her, feeling her Mexican indigenous aspects represented, while at the same time feeling those parts of herself disappear. This seems very similar to Heidegger's meditation on the de-worlding of cultural artifacts in the art industry. Anzaldua can't shake the recollection that there are still 10,000 Aztec survivors living in Mexico. Where are they during this exhibit? So Anzaldua moves on in this chapter to speak of border assemblages, a number of prominent Chicana and Chicano painters and artists, starting with Yolanda Lopez's portrait of the artist as the Virgin of Guadalupe. He sees resemblance between the moon goddesses or Coacuacui's vigorous and warlike energies as portrait, which depicts a Chicana Mexicana woman emerging and running from an oval halo of rays that look like thorns, with the traditional Virgin's mantle in one hand and the serpent in the other. The portrait suggests a cultural rebirth of the Chicana struggling to free herself from oppressive gender roles. According to Anzaldua, border art supersedes the pictorial. It depicts both the soul of the artist and the soul of the people or pueblo. It deals with who tells stories and what stories and histories are told. Slash in the Spanish word for we, nosotros, means us, other. It is cleft or a rajadura. We are all insiders and outsiders, conqueror and conquered, oppressor and oppressed. And our very sense of identity is defined or constituted by this proximity and intimacy of irreconcilable aspects of ourselves. Artistas nepentleras intervene here in order to reveal to us the hybrid geography of the self, all the different cities and countries at which we stand at the threshold of in the many different worlds we inhabit. The most significant chapter in Anzaldua's book, Light and the Dark, for the philosophy of art and aesthetics is chapter 5, Putting Colquaquit Together, in which Anzaldua very intimately recounts in narrative form her own creative process. Instead of the work setting up the world, as in Heidegger, Anzaldua speaks of the artist settling into art. Some things will go wrong, and this is the way of life. You'll need a contingency plan to deal with the cycles of stress and turmoil and depression that you create for yourself when you commit to the obstacles that are part of your creative process. When you slam into a block or get bitten by a writing virus, remember to let it work through your body like water through a blowhole. You'll have to release stress by taking time out and giving yourself treats, permission to laze, and your favorite food. Escape under the covers with a thriller. You'll have to focus on the pleasure writing or creativity gives you and on what motivates you. And if your daily process doesn't allow you to finish and still have a life, you'll have to create another schedule. Anzaldua describes in touching detail her own problems with facing procrastination. The royal you that subtends this chapter speaks to everyone, but above all to herself. You have inflated unrealistic notions about the amount you can accomplish in a day, so you double the time you think the project will take. You map out the territory, the number of pages you aim for, you divide into parts. On the calendar, you mark deadlines for each step of each stage, and every few days you reassess, reschedule. None of this works to keep you on track, but you begin again to brood. You nurture an idea by ignoring it, and you sit on an egg until the tension begs to be written off. The creative rush of ideas, the sudden flash of another reality, rises out of the sea and is exhilarating. All of a sudden, your spirit is renewed. Unlike the rest, this aspect of writing is effortless, but the deep dives scare you. There's always a monster in the cave. The deeper you go, the sharper its fangs. You don't find a way in, it will find a way out. The next morning, you stay in bed, eyes closed, lying quietly, blankets and pillows, a womb cave of the night, entreating the moon goddess to keep the daylight at bay. The moon lifts the veil between the inner and outer worlds that you cross over. Protected by darkness, you descend into the warm velvet underground cave. Rivulets of water sluice around you, swirling, eddying images rise up, accompanied by sensations so brief that if you're not paying attention, they won't register. And then comes the process of reworking or redrafting, trying to control the rebel that forces itself out and balks at any discipline. You hate ironclad schedules and routines. You struggle to find a methodology, a way of working that is constant, consistent. Balancing every aspect of your life isn't easy. Writing and all art is like pulling miles of entrails out of your mouth. So why this resistance? And at this point, Anzaldua gives us her own version of what we've already explored in the class as the novalis experiment. 95% of writing is reading, musing on books, for Anzaldua on mythology, or Aztec nagualismos, readingly in all disciplines, taking notes, brewing some chai tea, finding music to accompany a visionary scape, to shift consciousness. What's she going to listen to today? Tex-Mex, ambient, enigma, Lourdes Perez, the cavernous cello sounds of Yo-Yo Ma playing the back suite it is. The novalis experiment is actually a transitional or liminal condition into the possibility of creativity. For Anzaldua, you do a 5-minute meditation, observing your mind streaming, say your writer's prayers, and begin to compose. And finally, all that effort and some words start to come out on the page. Composing is like an osseous process, the formation of bones. It feels like sweating blood. You conjure up the source of images, the unconscious El Cenote, and throw yourself in and swim among the images and memories of other times when writing was successful. You free write 5 or 6 pages at warp speed, not focusing on forms. You keep the critical editing consciousness at bay. At this point, you feel great. You're a medium channeling your own story, a conductor orchestrating your own creative process. But alas, the results are horrifying. The moment of reckoning is at hand, and you have to write off the entire first attempt. It's an uncoordinated mass, a pile of dead bones. As soon as it was done, you felt like a Mozart, but the next morning, you realized you created a Frankenstein-like monster. The Coelquaqui you put together is a grotesque figure with arms sitting out of her back, her skull hanging between her legs, her eye sockets for knees. You pull your hair and snarl at the screen. You'll now have to take the whole thing apart again, bone by bone, go through the psychic dismemberment, implode and splinter once more. The creative process is full of groans. You take a deep breath and you pick it up again. How are you going to breathe, much less dance, by the deadline that is just 2 weeks away? And so the deadline is postponed. As the sun begins to rise and burns off the fog on the coastline, you print up yet another draft. You pull Coelquaqui again. Nepantla reassembles the fragments around different emerging centers. Months later, you're on attempt 10. And rather than feel like you've accomplished everything now rings even more hollow, the heartbeat silenced by dead wood. Not only does the story say nothing new, it says everything badly. It doesn't engage the reader emotionally. You've literally revised it to death. So you give up temporarily. You don't want to work on it anymore. You've run a marathon of endurance and now you're drained 6 miles before the finish line. You hate the incompletes hovering over you and you feel like a sack of turds. All the projects you wanted to accomplish, all the ambitions you had to fully develop and channel your creative resources. You haven't lived up to your potential. Disgusted, you look around at your creative studio and every surface is just a mess. You resent the pressure from yourself, from those around you. Produce, it's all that matters. And yet you feel like a total failure. This is the shadow side of writing or creativity, the deeper integration of all the pieces and balance between order and chaos. You know the solution to your blocks or impasses, the Coatlicue, lies in a deeper integration of your psyche, and you don't have time anymore to brood in a cave. It's altogether too much. You throw up your hands and head to the beach. Later on, you hear that very day, 2 people were swept up in the rocks and drowned right where you were walking. You feel like it was you. Art, Anzaldua writes, is a sacrifice. Nobody said it was going to be easy. And in many ways, nobody hates the vampire art more than the artist. Face it, she writes, you've fallen out of love. You can't stand the sight of your own work. You toss the text on the desk, feel a sense of relief for giving up, and you put it away indefinitely. For days you binge read through your depression. You're like the child who cries out in a temper tantrum, I hate my favorite food. Your friends try to comfort you. You're really doing the best you can. Don't be so hard on yourself. You're not an ice cream machine. It takes courage and a lot of hard work to return to what you've done and to see it through to completion. At this point, the phase of accepting limitation. There is never a final fin, completion, just a lot of small ones. Like a person's life, all art is a work in progress. And you hope that one day, after many more revisions and retakes, you will finally emerge from the cauldron and maybe gain a little bit of that artistic immortality, that elixir of life we call art. For now, you put the best version of an unfinished work into an envelope and stick it into a mailbox, offering it to the world. Although we've only been able to cover parts of Anzaldua's stupendous book, Light in the Dark, we can see the whole thing in terms of a 7-fold structure, of which the Coelquaqui imperative, or chapter 5, on Anzaldua's creative process is just one part. Only 6 chapters of this work were completed before Anzaldua's death, so we have to imagine the 7th. I hope you've enjoyed your lecture on Anzaldua's philosophy, specifically in relation to her views on art and aesthetics this week. And I'll see you all again next week. Thanks for listening.